well, for the purposes of keeping to time, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Uwe, and I'm going to Dulleck. Thank you, Professor of Economics at QUT. Welcome, Uwe, and we're looking forward to hearing about your theme, which is, we've got it up there, number 2, how can mobility data be used to monitor trends in road usage and traffic movements? Thank you, Uwe. After you.
My title is slightly different, but I get back to the answer to these questions at the end. Maybe a little bit of background. QT is a Center for Behavioral Economics, Society and Technology. We have a strong policy evaluation focus. So what I actually try to show you maybe a little bit as well, how you can use this type of data to look at policy evaluation. And we talk about natural experiments, and the nice thing is what we just heard before, the type of bushfires, but also the COVID pandemic are actually great ways to use these random events to actually see to what extent our infrastructure delivers the type of policy aims that you may have. Right, so I give you a little bit more a spin on well-being, because that was one of the things that we found particularly interesting. And we hear a lot in public policy about, well, we now hear about well-being budgets. The new government talks more about that, but we hear more about inclusive growth, inequality, and so on. So we actually thought, if we start looking at this question of infrastructure, how can we learn from this type of data and actually think about the big policy questions, where we otherwise maybe need to look a little bit broader how to find data and actually start to get insights. And I do feel that this project gave us a chance to look at that a little bit more. My colleague Steve Bigley is online. That's why I put him there in bold, and I added a photo, because I thought you never know. If you have any technical questions, he would be much better placed to answer them, but I can try to dabble there as well. Very quickly, why do I talk about that? We talk about infrastructure, and I try to convince you a little bit about well-being, big topics that we heard about in the last couple of years when we started to think about what should inform public policies. A couple of Nobel Prize winners there. We think more about community. Community is important for resilience, but also for well-being. We talk a lot about the deaths of despair. And this is like to what extent public policies and public infrastructure actually lead to this pandemic of suicides and drug use, not here in Australia, but in the US. And I think it's sometimes good to look at that. Very often, I think the great thing of being in Australia is we can learn on what happens elsewhere and maybe get ready. Joe Stiglitz did a lot of work around inequality, and it's just some of the examples to I think, get some inspiration why we try to take this angle and said this data actually can give you a lot of more insights about how to look at infrastructure and how to think about what the infrastructure, what service it provides, but then what can we learn from this type of data. Next slide. So lots of work has been done already. Just a couple of backgrounds. Let's move on. It's not completely new, but we look at what happens here. Our natural experiment, we had the COVID lockdowns. So instead of looking at that purely from a compliance perspective, that would be one way to interpret the data. You could also start to ask this type of inequality questions. So one of the questions that we were interested in is how are different socioeconomic groups affected by the lockdowns, and this is the twist that I have a little bit less chance to talk about, but we started looking at as well, and you see a little bit of that. What are the characteristics of neighborhoods that actually give you a resilience so that people can live locally, for example, in the situations where you want to reduce mobility, but also considerations of work and play. So can people actually recharge, right? So this is the type of big policy context that I want to more or less put into your mind and say, can we actually use this type of data to inform some of these questions? Next slide. Very quickly, I think I talked about a lot of these type of things from a policy perspective and from basic economics type of perspective. As a researcher, we found it really exciting that there is actually finally data out there where we don't just do some sort of survey that's usually quite expensive and takes a lot of time to get, but we actually can use data that is there and ask a broad range of questions. Right, I chose this big question about inequality and well-being and how can we get some sort of insights into that to actually illustrate, and that was a little bit the discussions we had within the team and the Health and Wellbeing Queensland team to actually show that this data is there, and if you do a bit of work, quite some work, but it's actually relatively easily adaptable to answer a broad range of questions, and sometimes big questions, right? Major decisions that we have to make, but even bringing it down to very small scale, like we talked about, thinking about what are aspects of the transport system that actually would have dramatic impact, not only on transport or transport times in general, but also on different groups within the population. Right? If we feel that we want to get more equal, inclusive growth, more fair participation in a lot of activities, we can use data like this to actually understand what is the impact on, let's call it a distributional aspect on that, right? And again, think back about this deaths of despair arguments that may be major issues we should actually start thinking about. Okay. Very quick. You heard about the DSpark data. The DSpark data already does have a lot of information in there. We looked for additional data to supplement some of our questions. So there's a number of supplementary data. I think there's some things where we could have worked even closer with the team, but there was a lot of give and take, and for us it was really interesting, and I hope for the team at DSpark as well, and I think we could do even more. That's what we always want to do as researchers. Next slide. So some quick example, I talked about socioeconomic data, and DSpark mentioned it as well. You can look at different regions within Queensland, more or less really classify what's the socioeconomic status. So that was a little bit the idea, and then we used very similar techniques to what you saw before. Next slide. I think we just can move on because we talked about that. This is the type of extra data that we looked at to get extra information about land use, and it's again data that's partly there, but you can actually get this idea, where does this infrastructure and maybe the public policy element come from. We have information about what are infrastructures that are there. We can look at this random event to actually try to see to what extent this infrastructure has the desired impact, but also how does it affect different groups in the population, where maybe is most need to actually and get most bang for the buck out, if you consider thinking about what are the next important steps in that, right? So we can actually do this evidence-driven. That's the econometrics. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to talk you through that. If there is a nerd in the room, talk to me, or even better, hook up with Ben online. We can talk you through some of that. I'm pretty sure most of the people that work here are either coming with a statistics, econometrics, structural approach, or they come with a machine learning approach. This is a typical example for a structural approach, right? So you somehow think a little bit about what could be the setup, and then you test these type of things. Again, why is that good? That is the policy evaluation question to a large extent, right? You come with an idea what you want to achieve and how the world works, and you want to find out whether there's evidence that it may work or whether it will work, right? What we did then is to look at travel times for people, and actually looked at the different income quintiles, I think we have there. So we really look at different income groups and see how do they react to the lockdown. Can they actually reduce their mobility? Can they not? And then the next step would be to go even further and say, what are the characteristics of the infrastructure that is there to actually see what drives these effects, right? I show you here the aggregate effects because that's, I think, the way how we can look at the data. But we started to look a little bit further into what are aspects of a neighborhood, for example, that lead to reductions in this type of mobility. And we do this, and again, this connects back to this broader policy perspective for work and for playtime, right? If you really think about that there may be an issue like impact on maybe poorer groups of society, what happens around us at the moment. This data could actually give you information about what are the neighborhood characteristics that actually make sure that people engage in recreation, play, and can recharge from their lives, right? And can we learn about this? Where is that needed? And this type of data I think it is in principle possible. I wouldn't say we have all the answers already there, but this is a case study that I think really makes the point it can be done. And the nice thing is that you always have this type of lots of new ideas and more questions that are there. So that would be a very quick and high level overview. I think hopefully you saw, you got the ideas. A couple of thoughts for us, if you want to go to the next slide. So we could do a lot more, right? I just talked about the inefficiency on that, the distribution over different income groups. You could ask much more about how do we ensure that, for example, different socioeconomic groups interact more if we find that important, right? What are the effects of gender, age compositions? We haven't done that at all, but as we heard before, it could be done, right? We just looked at certain parts, aspects of society, and how can we learn from what's the infrastructure there using this mobility data to actually do policy evaluation. And we can go further about, for example, asking questions of values in different communities. What is the impact of that? What's the type of infrastructure in a very broad sense that you need to achieve the outcomes? Next one. And this was then really further and bigger. We had an unfortunately unsuccessful ARC linkage public application in where we really said, well, let's actually develop this further and go much more concrete into details and actually ask and work with the team in the government on specific projects and illustrate how this could actually be answered with DSpark data. We are working to get this back in. So I know government money is always very in very short supply, and we just showed why that is the case. But we try to build the team again. Again, if that one I would really love to talk to you about. But if you had any type of idea and examples, what type of policy evaluation we could do with this type of data, we would be actually really keen to develop this framework further. And in that discussion, we actually talked a lot about how can we come up with using different type of methods of policy evaluation, talked about AI and machine learning, as well as the structural approaches, and try to learn how do you generate, for example, data that is agnostic towards the methods, so that we can learn what are the right methods to evaluate the right policy question. That was the big thing at the end, maybe. Thank you.